In this video, I'd like to go into a little bit more depth about the Middle Ages, and we're going to focus on how healthy was the medieval countryside. And as I said in a previous video, 90% of the population lived in the countryside. So this is basically how healthy were the majority of the people. Now I'm going to talk you through some major factors and major themes in the medieval countryside. In the medieval countryside, the main thing that everybody relied on to be healthy was a harvest. If the harvest was great, everybody was very healthy. If the harvest was bad, people went without food and they starved. And so everybody became reliant on a decent harvest. And when the harvest was very bad, when the weather was very bad, it could lead to famine. And that happened in 1315 when there was a great famine and 10% of the population died. Now, in terms of food in the medieval countryside, it's actually reasonably healthy, because most medieval peasants lived on something called pottage, which was a stew made from vegetables, which you can see a picture of on this slide. But there were some dangers, though, in the medieval countryside in terms of food. In really damp conditions, a fungus grew on rye, which many medieval people made into bread, and that fungus could cause a disease called ergotism, whose victims suffered pustules on their skin and a burning sensation. Some medieval peasants, though, did also eat fish from the streams, and those fish, which were nearly always ate on Fridays because the church encouraged it, and remember, we looked at how powerful the church was before, then actually medieval peasants got some diets, some vitamins in their diet. So in terms of food in the medieval countryside, it's really not bad. Water was also not bad in the medieval countryside. Pretty much every village had a stream or a spring, and that provided water for humans and animals. Springs often fed wells, and in wells, which you can see in the picture here, this man is fetching water from his well. The water was even cleaner because the animals didn't get involved in it. The water from these springs and wells was often made to make cider and ale was really made from barley wheat, and that added more nutrition in. And everybody drank beer. And beer at this time was not in any way as strong as it is in the modern age, and often this beer was something we call small beer. And small beer was actually probably only 1 or 2% alcohol, and as a result, actually it kills off the germs, it doesn't really get you that drunk, and it does okay for you. So in terms of water and drink in the medieval countryside, they are also pretty actually healthy. Their housing was a different case though, and the houses in the medieval countryside were not healthy, because most peasants lived in very simple huts, and those huts were made often from sticks covered in mud, and we call this, the official word is wattle and daub. Some peasants did live in bigger houses with timber frames, which you can see in this picture here, but often, even if you lived in a bigger house, you had an open hearth or an open fire in the middle of your house. Having an open fire in a house meant there was no chimney, so smoke was everywhere inside your house, making it actually quite uncomfortable and unhealthy. In the Middle Ages, they didn't really have carpets or proper flooring in the way that we do now, so medieval peasants in the countryside often just had straw on the floor of their house, also leading to some health problems. So, yes, housing was one of those things where definitely they were not that healthy. Their waste is a very similar picture, and the way that they got rid of waste was also not great. They didn't have toilets in the same way that we do now. In fact, actually, probably we now think that most people in the Middle Ages in the countryside had what we call a waste tip or a midden. A waste tip or a midden. And they would put all their floor sweepings and their animal dung on that midden. Their human waste would probably then go into a cesspit, which would also be normally at the bottom of their garden, and these cesspits were literally just a simple dug hole. So people were pooing and weeing into a hole. At that time, because this is a very good fertilizer, in the medieval countryside, people did often then use the waste from those middens and cesspits as fertilizer on the fields. To an extent, that's actually quite sensible because it will help your plants grow, but it also does obviously come with some health problems. So if we're going to sum this up, how healthy was the medieval countryside? There are some aspects that are very healthy. Food is surprisingly quite healthy. Drink is surprisingly quite healthy in the medieval countryside. However, there were some major problems of living in the countryside. You were completely reliant on the harvest, which you can see being collected in this picture here, and if it was a bad harvest, you would have felt the problems of that. In addition to that, the housing was not that healthy at this time, and the system of getting rid of waste was also basic at best.